Welcome to CardioCast for Friday, December 20. I'm Dr. Jim Dwyer. This week, how diabetes and insulin may boost patients' risks of bleeding and cardiovascular-related death, why therapeutic nihilism endangers older patients with diabetes, and how the Trump administration plans to allow states and pharma firms to import prescription drugs. But first, the Food and Drug Administration has allowed the use of icosapent ethyl for reducing cardiovascular events in high-risk patients with high triglycerides who are already taking statins. The drug, also called Vascepa, is the first and only FDA-approved triglyceride-lowering medication for reducing cardiovascular risk beyond cholesterol-lowering therapy, the manufacturer Amarin said in a statement. Vascepa was first approved 7 years ago for lowering triglycerides. It is a highly purified formulation of icosapentaenoic acid derived from fish, but it is not fish oil. It is meant for use in patients with triglyceride levels of at least 150 milligrams per deciliter who have diabetes, established cardiovascular disease, or risk factors for cardiovascular disease. The decision was based primarily on results of the REDUCE-IT trial, which tested Vascepa in more than 8,000 patients. It showed a statistically significant 25% relative risk reduction in the trial's primary endpoint of major adverse cardiovascular events. In a November meeting, the FDA's Endocrinologic and Metabolic Drugs Advisory Committee voted unanimously for approval of the new indication. The agency notes that in clinical trials, Vascepa was linked to an increased risk of atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter, especially in patients with a history of either condition. It was also associated with an increased risk of bleeding events, particularly in those taking blood thinners. Patients with diabetes may face a significantly greater risk of bleeding, cardiovascular-related death, and poorer net outcomes, particularly those treated with insulin. That's the takeaway from a sub-analysis of the ENGAGE AF-TIMI 48 trial. Researchers from Mount Sinai Hospital in New York presented their findings at the World Congress on Insulin Resistance, Diabetes, and Cardiovascular Disease. The investigators note that AFib is associated with a 5-fold increased risk of stroke, and type 2 diabetes is linked with a 2-fold increased risk of stroke. And when AFib and type 2 coexist, thromboembolic risk rises even more. In the original ENGAGE trial, more than 21,000 patients with AFib within the previous 12 months were randomized to either warfarin or the novel oral anticoagulant edoxaban. The sub-analysis presented looked at the 36% of ENGAGE participants who had diabetes. Most of them did not require insulin. The investigators found that the risk of stroke or systemic embolic events was similar between patients with and without diabetes. But patients with diabetes had a 29% greater adjusted risk of cardiovascular death than patients without diabetes. They also faced a 28% greater risk of major adverse cardiovascular events as well as of major bleeding. Plus, they were 25% more likely to suffer the net outcome of stroke, systemic embolic events, major bleed, or all-cause death. The main ENGAGE trial showed that high-dose edoxaban cut the rates of stroke and systemic embolic events by 13% compared with warfarin. But the sub-analysis showed no significant advantage to edoxaban for patients with diabetes. The investigators noted that patients with diabetes who were treated with insulin were at a higher adjusted risk for all outcomes compared with those who were not treated with insulin. We'll be right back after this message. Also at the Insulin Resistance Conference, one expert said that it's time for diabetes treatment guidelines to evolve, given the growing number of positive data from cardiovascular outcome trials in type 2 diabetes. Dr. Richard Prattley, who is medical director of Advent Health Diabetes Institute in Orlando, warns against therapeutic nihilism. The idea that by the time someone is 75 years old, you won't be able to impact outcomes with directed therapy. Current treatment guidelines for diabetes in older people remain focused on glycemic control, but Dr. Prattley says it's not hyperglycemia that's killing people, it's heart disease and renal disease. Recent studies of diabetes drugs have demonstrated that older diabetes patients benefit from treatment, even those with cardiovascular comorbidities. DPP-4 and SGLT2 inhibitors, as well as GLP-1 receptor agonists, can be safely used in older patients with cardiovascular disease. And those drugs' benefits extend beyond diabetes. Cardiovascular outcomes also improve in those older patients. Dr. Pradley says that means clinicians need to change their focus to patient-important outcomes, dying, heart attack, and strokes, and avoid therapeutic nihilism. The Department of Health and Human Services is taking the first steps towards allowing prescription drugs to be imported into the United States. HHS is proposing 2 pathways for importation. The first would allow states to design programs to import certain drugs directly from Canada. The second would allow manufacturers to obtain a new national drug code number to import their own FDA-approved products manufactured outside of the U.S. HHS Secretary Alex Azar says the new pathways could move the U.S. toward a more open and competitive marketplace that supplies patients with safe, effective, and affordable prescription drugs. Under the first proposal, only certain drugs would be eligible for importation from Canada. The drugs would need to be approved in Canada and, except for Canadian labeling, need to meet the conditions of an FDA-approved new drug application or abbreviated new drug application. Controlled substances, biologics, intravenously injected drugs, drugs with a risk evaluation and management strategy, and drugs injected into the spinal column or eye would be excluded from importation. States would have to show that importing drugs poses no additional risk in public health and safety, and they would have to show that importation led to cost reductions. But Secretary Azar acknowledges that many of the most expensive drugs, as well as insulins, would not be eligible for importation under the pathway. In the second proposed pathway, the FDA would give manufacturers guidance on importing their own FDA-approved products manufactured abroad. Under this proposal, there would be no restriction on which type or kind of FDA-approved product could be imported. You can find these stories and more by visiting www.mdedge.com/cardiology or by clicking the links in the podcast notes. This week's contributors include Doug Brunk and Gregory Twachtman, and CardioCast Cardiology News and MDedge Cardiology are edited by Catherine Hackett. Remember, you can find CardioCast via Amazon Alexa, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, or wherever you listen to podcasts. For MDedge, I'm Dr. Jim Dwyer.